Vallejo, California is not the kind of city that makes national headlines for horror. It sits quietly along the northern edge of the San Francisco Bay, a working-class city shaped by shipyards, long commutes, and neighborhoods where life is mostly predictable. Streets curve through modest residential blocks. Porch lights flick on at dusk. Dogs bark behind fences. On most nights, the loudest sound is a passing train or a car accelerating too fast down an empty road. This is a place where people believe they are safe behind closed doors. In 2015, Vallejo was still recovering from years of economic decline and a shrinking police force. Response times were slow. Patrol coverage was thin. Residents knew this, but they adapted, locking doors, installing porch lights, trusting that ordinary precautions were enough. Violent home invasions were rare. Kidnappings were almost unheard of. And that assumption, that safety was the default, was exactly what made this place vulnerable. On the surface, nothing about the neighborhood stood out. No high crime statistics. No warnings from police. No history of serial violence. The homes were close together, separated by fences and driveways. People waved at neighbors they barely knew. It was the kind of environment where danger was expected to come from outside, dark alleys, bad neighborhoods, unfamiliar streets. Not from inside the home. In the months leading up to the crime, there were no public alerts. No pattern recognized by law enforcement. No visible threat moving through the area. But unseen, someone was already preparing. Studying routines. Learning layouts. Testing boundaries. The most dangerous predators don't arrive loudly. They arrive quietly, and early. This was a crime made possible by familiarity. By routine. By the belief that locking the door was the final step. Night in Vallejo settles slowly. By 10 p.m., most homes are dark. By midnight, the streets are nearly empty. Police patrols pass infrequently, if at all. The stillness feels peaceful, but it also means there are fewer witnesses, fewer interruptions, fewer chances for help to arrive in time. Inside one home, two people were asleep, unaware that their safety had already been compromised. There was no forced entry that shattered glass. No alarm blaring. No warning sound that would wake the neighbors. The entry was controlled. Deliberate. Planned. This wasn't a crime of impulse. It wasn't fueled by rage or chaos. It was methodical. The kind of crime that requires patience, preparation, and emotional detachment. The kind that begins long before the victims ever realize they are in danger. What made this case especially disturbing was not just what happened, but where it happened. A bedroom. A place designed for rest. For privacy. For vulnerability. In crimes like this, location matters. The offender didn't choose a street corner or a parking garage. He chose a private residence because it offered something critical: time. Inside a home, there are no cameras on every corner. No strangers walking by. No immediate interference. And in Vallejo, that night, there was no one watching. The city's police department was understaffed, stretched thin across miles of territory. Calls were prioritized by severity. A silent home invasion, if no alarm was triggered, was invisible. Even if something went wrong, response would not be immediate. That reality created a gap. And that gap was exploited. The atmosphere of the city mattered. The assumptions mattered. The sense of normalcy mattered. Because crimes like this don't survive in chaos, they survive in calm. They thrive where people feel safe enough to let their guard down. What would follow would shake that belief to its core. But in this moment, before the crime, Vallejo was quiet. Still. Unaware. This was not a city bracing for tragedy. It was a city going to sleep. And somewhere nearby, a man with training, intelligence, and a carefully constructed plan was moving toward a home where no one expected him, and no one was ready. The environment did not create the offender. But it allowed him to operate. And once the line between public safety and private space was crossed, the rules changed. By morning, Vallejo would be forced to confront a reality it had never imagined, that the most terrifying danger was not outside, but already inside. Long before the crime unfolded inside a Vallejo bedroom, Matthew Muller was already living a divided life. On paper, Muller did not resemble the kind of man police search for after a violent home invasion and kidnapping. He was intelligent. Highly educated. A former U.S. Marine. A graduate of Harvard Law School. Someone trained in discipline, structure, and systems. That contrast, between what he appeared to be and what he became, would later become one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Muller's early life followed a trajectory of achievement. He excelled academically. He earned respect in structured institutions. The Marine Corps reinforced obedience, hierarchy, and planning. Harvard reinforced analytical thinking, logic, and strategy. These were not chaotic environments. They were controlled. And Muller learned how to operate inside control. But beneath that surface, there were fractures. Personal instability. Mental health struggles. An inability to sustain a conventional career. Over time, the structure that once contained him disappeared, and what remained was someone who still craved control, but no longer had a legitimate outlet for it. This matters, because the crime was not impulsive. It was engineered. Muller did not select victims at random. He did not act in public. He did not rely on speed or panic. Instead, he used preparation, tools, and psychological dominance. He planned for compliance. For silence. For confusion. The victims were chosen precisely because they represented normalcy. A couple in their home. Asleep. Unarmed. Expecting safety. Crimes like this are about power, not sexual impulse alone, but authority. Muller arrived with equipment designed to disorient and intimidate, restraints, blindfolds, weapons used for threat rather than immediate violence. His goal was not chaos. His goal was submission. He controlled light. He controlled movement. He controlled information. Victims later described confusion as one of the most powerful weapons used against them. They were kept in the dark, literally and psychologically. Instructions were given calmly. Threats were calculated. Violence was implied more often than it was immediately used. This is not the behavior of someone acting in a frenzy. It is the behavior of someone executing a plan. The victims, whose identities are protected in many public records, were not involved in criminal activity. They were not connected to Muller. There was no prior relationship. That randomness amplified fear, not just for them, but for the community. If there was no connection, then anyone could be next. Inside the home, Muller used deception as much as force. He presented himself as part of a larger operation. He implied surveillance. He suggested consequences beyond the immediate moment. These tactics are common among offenders who want victims to comply without resistance. Fear is more effective when it feels inevitable. For the victims, time distorted. Minutes felt like hours. Silence became terrifying. Every instruction carried the threat of escalation. In these situations, survival often depends on reading the offender, understanding when to comply, when to remain still, when not to provoke. They survived because they adapted. And that survival would later become crucial. What makes this chapter essential is understanding that this crime did not rely on physical strength alone. Muller relied on authority. On certainty. On the illusion that he was untouchable. That illusion would hold, for a while. But cracks were already forming. After the attack, Muller did not disappear emotionally. He returned to a life that was already unstable. He moved between locations. He lived out of his car at times. He stored evidence in places he believed would never be searched. This is where intelligence becomes dangerous, not because it guarantees success, but because it can delay failure. Meanwhile, the victims carried the aftermath. Trauma does not end when the offender leaves. It settles into memory, into sleep, into routine. Victims replay moments, searching for meaning, for mistakes, for warning signs that never existed. They did what survivors are often forced to do, rebuild while the system struggled to catch up. Law enforcement initially failed to connect the crime properly. Early skepticism, particularly toward the victim's account, would later become a source of public outrage. The idea that a kidnapping and sexual assault inside a home could be misinterpreted or minimized exposed deep flaws in investigative assumptions. Those flaws delayed justice. But they did not stop it. Because Muller left behind something he could not control. DNA. The same planning that allowed him to enter quietly did not extend to perfect erasure. Biological evidence remained. And unlike fear, DNA does not fade. It waits. Years would pass before technology, databases, and renewed investigation aligned. When they did, the image of Muller as an intelligent but harmless drifter collapsed instantly. The man with elite credentials was now exposed as a calculated predator. This chapter is not about shock. It is about contradiction. A man trained in law breaking the most fundamental laws. A controlled mind committing uncontrollable harm. Victims selected not for who they were, but for how vulnerable they could be made. By the time Muller was identified, the question was no longer whether he committed the crime. It was how long he had believed he would never be caught. And how many systems failed before they finally closed in. In the early morning hours of March 23, 2015, Vallejo was silent. The streets were empty. Porch lights glowed faintly. Inside one modest home, two people were asleep, unaware that the boundary between public safety and private space had already been crossed. At approximately 3 a.m., Matthew Muller entered the residence. There was no crash. No broken window. No alarm screaming into the night. The entry was quiet enough that neighbors never noticed. Inside the bedroom, the victims woke to a presence they could not see clearly. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness. A voice followed, calm, controlled, deliberate. Muller spoke with authority, giving instructions immediately, before confusion could turn into resistance. This was the first critical decision point. He did not allow time for questions. He did not allow time for panic. He asserted control instantly. Both victims were ordered to comply. Restraints were applied. Their vision was limited. The room they had fallen asleep in, once familiar, became disorienting. Directions came from different angles. The sense of space collapsed. Muller told them he was part of a larger group. He claimed their home had been watched. That there were consequences if they disobeyed. Whether these claims were true didn't matter. The effect was immediate. Fear works best when it feels organized. The male victim was restrained further and separated. This separation served two purposes, isolation and leverage. Muller knew that fear for another person can be more powerful than fear for oneself. He moved with purpose. Every action suggested rehearsal. Inside the house, nothing was destroyed. This was not a ransacking. He was not searching for valuables. He was executing a sequence. He brought with him what he needed. He left behind what he didn't. Within minutes, the female victim was removed from the home. She was blindfolded. Restrained. Taken outside. At this point, the crime shifted from invasion to abduction. The neighborhood remained silent. No one called police because no one saw anything. She was placed into a vehicle. The doors closed. The sound of the engine starting marked a moment of final separation from safety. For the male victim left behind, time froze. For the victim being taken away, it accelerated uncontrollably. Inside the car, Muller continued to control information. He spoke sparingly. He used silence strategically. Silence allows fear to grow without interruption. The drive lasted long enough to disorient. Routes were unfamiliar. Turns were impossible to track. This was intentional. Disorientation is a form of restraint. Eventually, the vehicle stopped. The location was remote. A small structure, later identified as a makeshift shelter, stood isolated from immediate help. There were no nearby houses. No traffic. No witnesses. This was where Muller believed he could operate without interference. Inside the structure, the assault occurred. The details are horrifying, but what matters for understanding the crime is how it was carried out. Muller continued to rely on control rather than uncontrolled violence. Threats were present. Compliance was enforced psychologically as much as physically. This was not about speed. It was about dominance. For hours, the victim endured a situation engineered to strip away autonomy. Muller believed he had designed the perfect crime: anonymous victims, no witnesses, no clear trail. But he made a critical error. He allowed the victim to live. Eventually, Muller returned her to the vehicle and drove her back toward Vallejo. This decision, whether driven by calculation, fear, or exhaustion, would undo him years later. When the vehicle stopped again, the victim was released near her home. Disoriented. Traumatized. Alive. Inside the house, the male victim was still bound, still waiting, still uncertain whether she would return. She did. And that moment, when survival turned into immediate action, changed everything. Police were called. When officers arrived, they encountered a scene that did not match their expectations. No broken doors. No visible chaos. Two victims describing an abduction that sounded methodical, planned, and precise. Initially, skepticism crept in. That skepticism would later become a national point of shame. But in this moment, evidence was collected. Statements were taken. DNA was preserved. Even though the system hesitated, biology did not. Muller believed that fear, silence, and disbelief would protect him. He believed that the lack of visible damage would work in his favor. That without a suspect, the case would stall. And for a time, it did. But this chapter, the crime itself, was already over. What remained was the long tail of consequences. The hours between entry and release were measured in terror. But the decisions made during those hours, what Muller brought, what he said, what he left behind, would echo for years. This was not a perfect crime. It was simply unfinished. When police left the Vallejo home that morning, the crime was technically over. But the damage was just beginning. Inside the house, there were no broken windows. No forced entry. No obvious signs of a violent struggle that matched what the victims described. For responding officers, the scene conflicted with expectation. And in criminal investigations, expectation can be dangerous. Statements were taken. Evidence was logged. DNA was collected. And then, slowly, the case lost momentum. The idea that a stranger had entered a home, kidnapped one occupant, committed a prolonged sexual assault, and then returned her alive strained belief for some investigators. The calmness of the offender, the lack of visible chaos, and the complexity of the account created doubt instead of urgency. That doubt stalled the case. In the days that followed, fear spread through Vallejo quietly. No official warning captured the gravity of what had happened. No suspect description circulated. Residents continued sleeping in their homes, unaware that the person responsible was still free, and still nearby. For the victims, the aftermath was isolating. Survivors often expect justice to move quickly, decisively. Instead, they encounter silence. Delays. Subtle skepticism. Every unanswered phone call reinforces the sense that what happened to them is slipping out of focus. The evidence, however, did not disappear. DNA taken from the crime scene was entered into databases. At the time, there was no match. The offender remained a name without a face. Years passed. Then, in 2016, something changed. In a separate case hundreds of miles away, a man was arrested after a break-in attempt. Inside his vehicle and residence, investigators found items that raised immediate red flags: weapons, restraints, goggles, and electronic devices that suggested surveillance and planning. The man was Matthew Muller. When his DNA was processed and compared, it matched the profile from the Vallejo kidnapping. The connection was undeniable. What had once been doubted was now proven in a laboratory. For Vallejo police, the realization was devastating. The crime had been real. The danger had been ongoing. And the delay had allowed a calculated offender to remain free far longer than he should have. Muller was arrested and charged. The case quickly gained national attention, not only for the crime itself, but for the failures that followed it. Public scrutiny intensified. Media coverage exposed the early missteps. Trust between the community and law enforcement was shaken. But for the victims, the focus narrowed. The man who had controlled their lives for hours was finally controlled himself. Interrogations were calm. Muller did not resist arrest. He did not erupt in anger. His demeanor mirrored the same detached control he had used during the crime. But the illusion of intelligence as protection was gone. Evidence spoke for him now. DNA. Tools. Digital traces. Patterns. The investigation expanded backward, uncovering additional offenses and confirming that the Vallejo attack was not an anomaly, it was part of a trajectory. By the time Muller entered the courtroom, there was no ambiguity left. The only remaining question was how the system would respond. This chapter is not about justice being served. It is about how long it took to arrive. Because when crimes like this are not believed immediately, they don't just harm victims once. They harm them repeatedly, through doubt, delay, and silence. The arrest closed one chapter. The consequences would define the next.